In the shadowed corners of Asia, where incense curls through temple eaves and forgotten chants echo between cracked statues, the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than you think. Here, ancient rituals are not just remembered, they are repeated. Spirits do not rest in peace, they wait. And what you call superstition, others call survival. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, a place where ghost stories are not fiction, but memory, where each tale is carved from centuries of belief, fear, and whispered warning. From cursed temples and wandering monks to haunted rivers and forbidden rites, every story you hear is rooted in the soil of old blood and broken oaths. Close your eyes, listen carefully, because tonight the spirits are whispering again.
The rain had stopped just before dawn. A thin mist clung to the canopy above the forest temple like old breath held too long. Crickets gave way to the occasional croak of a distant frog, and the early light sliced through the trees in slanted, reverent beams. Wat Pa Pa Pu, the temple of the forested mountain, lay still and silent, tucked deep within the arms of the jungle, hidden from time, hidden from noise. Novice monk Tom adjusted his saffron robe as he stepped across the dew-covered stone path that led toward the main hall. He was 16, quiet and slender, his eyes darker than most noticed, and always a little distant. Just last week, his mother had shaved his head with trembling hands and placed lotus petals at his feet before he stepped into the ordainment hall. Eyes wet, voice low. She had whispered, "Do this for your father. Let his spirit find peace through your merit." But peace had not come, only whispers. They started on the third night, faint at first, like a breeze rustling old cloth, but then unmistakable, a voice, his voice, low and gentle, coming from behind the locked doors of the ordainment room where old robes were kept. Tom had frozen where he stood, barefoot on the teakwelled floor, every hair on his skin rising in still silence. "Tom," the voice said, not loud, not sharp, but knowing. It wasn't a hallucination. He hadn't been tired. The sound was clear, like someone just beyond the door, waiting. That door. It was where the temple stored the robes of monks who had passed away. The dead were cremated, but their robes, soaked in decades of sweat and incense and prayer, were kept in that room for 7 days before being burned in a final rite. It was meant to be respectful, a transition, a waiting room between the worlds. Tom had never dared open it, until tonight. It was nearly midnight when he crept back to the ordainment room, the heavy silence of the forest pressing in on all sides. The path was dark, lit only by distant shimmer of votive candles at the foot of a nearby Buddha statue. The air felt thick, humid and clinging. Every step he took seemed louder than it should have been. The wooden door was old and painted with faded red. Its golden trim was chipped, and the handle had long since tarnished to dull brass. Tom hesitated, placing his hand over the metal, feeling it cold despite the heat of the night. Then, click. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the smell hit him first, sandalwood and ash overlaid with something older, something musky, like cloth forgotten in a temple cellar. Shelves lined the walls, each stacked with carefully folded monk robes, faded by time, still tied with ceremonial cords. And then he heard it again. "Tom." He turned sharply. The voice hadn't come from behind him, but from within the room, from the robes themselves. He didn't speak, didn't move. Then, He saw it. Near the far corner of the room, folded atop a small wooden altar, was a robe unlike the others. It was older, yellowed by time, torn at the edges. As he stepped closer, he saw that it wasn't folded like the others. It had been laid out, draped in a way that made it resemble a body, arms crossed, head bowed. But there was no head, no arms, just empty cloth. It smelled like his father. The exact scent from his childhood, sandalwood and oil and old sweat. He hadn't smelled it in years, and the familiarity clawed something open in his chest. He knelt before it, and without thinking, he reached out. The moment his fingers touched the cloth, something passed through him, cold, sharp and fast, like a current running up his arm and into his skull. His vision blurred, his breath caught, and in the distance, from inside his mind, he heard it again. "Don't be afraid, my son." The next morning, Tom sat beneath the Bodhi tree near the monk's dormitory, robe wrapped tightly around him, eyes distant. He hadn't told anyone. How could he? Who would believe him? But the robe, he had taken it. It now sat beneath the planks of his kuti, hidden, folded tightly inside a canvas sack. And all day as he chanted, walked meditation, and took his meals in silence, he heard it again and again, always just behind his thoughts. "You are ready now." The following night, he waited until the monks had gone to sleep. He lit a single candle. He placed a lotus blossom in front of his altar, and he pulled the robe from the sack. It felt heavier than before. He didn't understand why he did it, only that he had to, as though something older had taken root in his chest and was guiding him gently, softly, with the confidence of a father's hand on his shoulder. He removed his own robe, then, slowly, reverently, he wrapped the torn yellow robe across his shoulder and chest, the fabric coiling like something alive. The moment it touched his skin, his breathing slowed. The room darkened, though the candle still burned. Then, stillness. Not sleep, not wakefulness. A trance. His mind filled with images of things he couldn't understand, star maps, sacred diagrams, ancient scripts he had never studied. He heard voices, chanting, the hum of mantras older than the temple itself. He saw monks from another era, seated in a circle, one of them glowing darkly, eyes black and burning. Then a face, his father's, weeping, and a whisper, "You must not trust him." He woke at dawn covered in sweat. The robe had slid from his shoulder onto the floor. The candle had melted into nothing. And in the corner of the room, someone had drawn a circle in ash. The next few days passed in silence, but something had changed. When Tom spoke, the other novices listened more intently. When he chanted, the old monks nodded in approval. Villagers began approaching him after morning alms, asking for blessings, asking for dreams to be interpreted. They said he had the look, the inner light of wisdom. Even the head monk, Ajahn Kom, once stern and distant, began to watch him with eyes narrowed not in scorn, but in concern. And still the robe whispered. It began offering truths, secrets about the monks around him, what they hid, what they feared, the dark things they'd once done. It whispered sacred names and lost chants. It told him about death, about what waits, about how the dead do not rest, not always. And it promised more. "You were chosen, Tom. You are worthy." One night during a storm that rolled through the forest with crashing thunder, Tom returned to the ordainment room. He had questions now, demands, but the door was locked. not just shut, sealed. Someone had scratched white chalk symbols on the wood, circles and lines and foreign letters, protective charms, banishing signs. He recognized them. The robe had shown him. Someone was trying to keep him out. He turned away, rain slicing across his shaved head, robe soaked, heart pounding. A flash of lightning struck the old Bodhi tree. For a moment, its gnarled trunk glowed white, and Tom saw something beneath its roots. Something buried, something wrapped in old yellow cloth. The whisper had never lied, but the truth was beginning to rot. And Tom was no longer sure who he was hearing. His father? Or something that only wore his father's voice like a second skin. Something that had waited in silence, wrapped in a robe, waiting to be worn again.
The scent was stronger now, sandalwood, dry and ancient, like incense burned 1,000 times. It followed Thom everywhere, through the alms rounds, through the evening chants, even in his dreams. He never saw anyone burning it, but it lingered. Inside his kuti, it soaked into the floorboards. It clung to his robes like oil, and every time it drifted near, he felt comforted and uneasy, as if the scent itself was watching. That night, he did not wait for silence to fall. The sun had only just dipped beneath the trees when Thom returned to his kuti, heart tight in his chest. He slid the wooden bolt across the door, lowered the window shade, and reached beneath the floorboards. The robe was still there, coiled like a sleeping creature. He lifted it, the fabric cold despite the heat, and unrolled it slowly across the mat. He sat before it, cross-legged, bare from the waist up. His fingers trembled slightly. His breath came slow. And once again, without truly choosing, he wrapped the robe around his body. It settled like smoke, and his mind opened like a door kicked inward. The room was gone. He sat now beneath the stupa of an older temple, one he had never seen before, its golden spire broken, vines strangling its base. The jungle hummed around him, but something beneath the hum vibrated deeper, a sound he felt in his spine more than he heard with his ears. A low chant, monotone, male voices, dozens of them. Then from the darkened corridor, a man approached, shaved head, robed, but the robe was wrong, not saffron, but near brown, almost burned. His face was featureless, shifting. When he opened his mouth, it was Thom's voice that came out. When the soul is not ready for death, it finds another path. The image flickered. Thom screamed, but his voice echoed only in his skull. He was back in his kuti. The robe had slipped from his shoulder. But something was still with him. In the far corner of the room, the candle had relit itself. The next morning, Thom didn't remember dressing. He stood at the edge of the village, alms bowl in hand, eyes glazed, listening to a woman speak to him. She had lost her son, she said, 2 years now, died in the river during the rains. She still dreamed of him. She asked Thom to bless the water jar in her home. She looked at him like he knew something, like he could bring the boy back. Thom nodded slowly. Then he whispered something in her ear. She gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. She backed away, tears spilling down her cheeks. He didn't know what he had said, but it was her son's name, his nickname, a name no one else used. That night the whispers praised him. You see now what you were meant for. Word spread fast. The villagers said the novice was gifted, that he knew things.
that he had the third eye like the monks of old. They brought him fruit, knelt when he passed, called him Pi Tham now, elder, not novice. Even some of the monks began deferring to him during chanting, except the abbot. Ajahn Kom watched him like a man studying a crack in a dam. On the fifth night, Tham dared to wear the robe while meditating in the temple's main hall, something strictly forbidden. He waited until midnight. The other monks were asleep. The hall echoed with wind slipping through the high windows. He knelt before the Buddha statue, lit 3 sticks of incense, and wrapped the robe across his shoulder. He closed his eyes. Immediately, weightlessness. He floated, no longer in his body. He saw the temple from above, its rooftops lit by moonlight, the jungle pulsing around it. And then, deeper, underground, he saw roots, bones, stone jars buried beneath the ordainment hall, jars sealed with wax and cloth, filled with teeth, hair, ash. Saya Sat, the old ways, buried, feared, but never forgotten. He plummeted back into his body like a falling star, choking, shaking. When his eyes opened, the Buddha statue was weeping blood. He blinked again, and it was gone. The next day he found an old book in the library. It was bound in twine, yellowed and brittle. Not a Buddhist text, no author, no publisher, just ancient ink and hand-drawn illustrations. Diagrams of bodies, circles filled with symbols he recognized from his dreams. A note in the front read, "Recovered from the ruins of Wat Sayan Suk, destroyed in 1968, burn after reading." He hid it beneath his mat. That night he read every page. Somewhere deep in the book was a ritual, a way to see one's true self through fire, through possession, through the use of a spiritual anchor, an object soaked in death and devotion, like a robe worn by a monk who never wanted to die, like the one he had taken. The soul can outlive the flesh if it has a vessel. And beneath that line, scribbled in different handwriting, "But what if the vessel has no will?" He shut the book. He didn't sleep that night because in the dark he could hear breathing that wasn't his own. The scent of sandalwood grew unbearable by morning. It choked the air. Other novices noticed it too. They asked if Tham had hidden incense. He smiled, shook his head. But the scent wasn't incense anymore. It was rot, dressed in sweetness, the scent of something ancient, wearing a mask. Ajahn Kom called him that evening. The abbot's kuti was sparse, clean, incense burned quietly in the corner. The air was thick with oil and lemon balm. "Do you know," the abbot asked without turning, "why robes are kept before burning?" Tham said nothing. The abbot finally turned. His face was tired, older than yesterday. "They carry intention, and sometimes intention lingers longer than flesh. Some robes should never be worn again." That night, Tham stood beneath the Bodhi tree, the forbidden robe in his hands. He should burn it. He knew that. He could already feel the thing inside it waking up, stretching, growing stronger with each meditation, each chant, each blind devotion. But it had also given him something: power, knowledge, reverence. No longer just a boy from a grieving family. Now he was someone the villagers looked up to, someone whose name carried weight. And besides, his father's voice was there, still calling him, still whispering, "You're doing so well, my son." And so he folded the robe again, gently, like dressing a body for burial, and placed it beneath his mat once more.
Above him, the leaves of the Bodhi tree rustled in windless air, and in the shadows between the roots, something moved. By the seventh day, the statues began to change. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in their gaze, the faintest tilt of a head. But Thom noticed, and once you noticed, you could never unsee it. The main Buddha statue in the sala, seated in marbled serenity with downcast eyes, now seemed to glance sideways when no one looked. The gilded Arahant by the gate, once expressionless, bore a faint smirk that hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't just in his mind. Even the dogs refused to sleep near the altars now. The villagers continued arriving in growing numbers. Some brought rice, others brought pain. A woman came with a child who hadn't spoken since the cremation of his grandfather, a man whose dreams were haunted by the voice of his dead wife, a girl who said her shadow kept detaching from her feet at night. They came to Thom, not to the abbot, not to the senior monks, to him. And when he touched their heads and whispered blessings, something moved inside them and inside him. One by one, they said they felt lighter. He felt heavier. Achan Kom no longer watched him from afar. He began visiting Thom directly, asking odd questions, always polite, but always with a deeper current beneath his words. Have you been meditating longer lately? Yes, Luangpur. Have you been reading texts outside the Vinaya? No, Luangpur. Have you heard anything in your kuti at night? Thom paused. Just wind and perhaps echoes. Achan Kom studied him, but said no more. That evening, Thom walked the temple grounds alone. The twilight sky painted everything in bruised purple. Bells swayed gently in the wind, their tones uneven, disharmonious. He stopped before the standing Buddha statue near the banyan tree, a relic centuries old, its eyes cast downward in eternal contemplation. But tonight, its pupils seemed deeper, darker, and in the dimness, Thom saw it blink. He staggered backward. The wind howled through the trees. The bells stopped. He looked again. The statue was still, frozen in posture, eyes calm. But he knew. Something had looked back at him. Not from within the statue, but through it. Later that night, he returned to his kuti, robe clutched tightly, pulse hammering in his throat. He lit no candles, sat in the dark, and unwrapped the sacred cloth like a relic thief unearthing a curse. He placed it around his shoulders. This time, he didn't even chant. The trance came instantly. He stood now inside the ordainment room, but it was no longer filled with cloth and incense. It was flooded with blood, knee-high, thick, warm, and the robes floated atop it, drifting like bodies without breath. In the center stood the same monk from before, face blurred, robe near black, chanting with a voice made of bone and ash. Let the soul bind, let the flesh obey, let the vessel kneel. Behind him, rows of monk statues lined the walls, identical, faceless, frozen, until they began to turn, one by one, each facing him, each opening eyes that never had been carved, and in those eyes reflected was Thom, not as he was, but as something else, mouth black with ash, fingers long and clawed, a robe soaked in shadows, and he was smiling. He awoke gasping, drenched in sweat. Outside, the temple bell rang twice. It was not the hour, and no one had touched the rope. The next day, the novices whispered among themselves. One claimed he saw the Naga statue at the gate yawn. Another said the Buddha in the library had bled from the eyes. And one boy, wide-eyed, barely 12, ran crying to Achan Kom, saying the preaching monk statue in the sala had moved its hand to silence him. The abbot called for an emergency meeting. No public rituals tonight. No chanting. No one leaves their kuti after dark. He did not give a reason, but everyone obeyed. Except Thom. Just past midnight, he stood once more before the main Buddha statue. He was drawn to it now, as if the stone itself pulled him forward. The moon bathed the hall in silver, casting long shadows across the floor. The incense had long since burned out. The silence was thick enough to drown in. He knelt. The statue stared ahead, or so it appeared, and slowly, deliberately, Thom raised the robe. He did not wear it. He placed it at the statue's feet. A test, a gift, a challenge. Then he whispered, "Who are you?" Silence. Then, from deep within the stone, a crack, so small it could have been the building settling. But then, another and another. Hairline fractures veined across the Buddha's chest like spider legs. And from the deepest one, sand. No, ash. Thom reached forward. His fingers brushed the ash, and, in a moment, a voice, not spoken but inhaled, filled his skull. Not who, what. He stumbled backward. The robe was gone. Gone. He turned, panicked, searching the altar, the mat, the shadowed corners. And then he saw it, worn, on the statue, wrapped around it, perfectly placed as if it had always belonged. And the statue was smiling. In the following days, no one else saw it. To them, the robe was never there. To them, the statue looked unchanged. But every time Thom entered the sala, the statue's smile grew wider, and its eyes, once carved in serene stillness, now followed him. What is devotion, if not surrender? What is worship, if not blind? And what is blindness, if the gods themselves refuse to close their eyes? It was during the third week that the shadows began to move on their own, not just flickering from candles or shifting moonlight. These moved with intention. They lingered after footsteps, reached beforehand, and they began to follow Thom, always just behind him, always just out of sight. It began with the chanting hall, the sala. By day, it was a place of stillness, of discipline. Rows of monks and novices seated in order, voices harmonizing into ancient mantras that hung in the air like suspended breath. But by night, the sala emptied. Its silence grew thick. Its statues, its paintings, and its walls seemed to listen. And something inside it began to awake. One night, as the moon hung full and pale above the temple roofs, Thom entered the sala alone. He wasn't meant to. The rules were clear. No one should be inside after the final bell. But the robe had called to him again, not with words this time, but with hunger, a pulsing need, a promise wrapped in silence. He walked barefoot across the cool tile floor, each step echoing louder than the last. The main Buddha statue sat at the far end, still cloaked in stone serenity, but Thom felt it, the weight of its stare, the depth of its gaze. He bowed low. And in that moment, just as his forehead touched the floor, he heard it. A breath. Not his, not the wind. A slow exhale coming from behind him. He froze. His heart climbed into his throat. The sala was locked. No one else had entered. He rose slowly, turning his head. The hall was empty. Empty but wrong. Something felt present, like invisible eyes blinking open. He scanned the pillars, the shadows, the crevices beneath the altar, and that's when he saw it. A shape at the back of the sala. Still, tall, unmoving. A man? No, darker than a man. A void in the shape of one. No face, no robes, just shadow standing where it shouldn't. Watching. Not menacing, not yet, but waiting. Tom didn't speak, didn't move. He just lowered his gaze and began chanting. Quietly at first, then louder. The mantras spilled from him, practiced, disciplined, but then shifted. The words changed, became a dialect he didn't know. Syllables twisted into shapes no novice should recite, but he didn't stop, because the shadow was listening and smiling, not with lips, but with its presence. A vibration, a hum, like satisfaction. When the chant ended, the shape vanished, but not with fear, with approval. The next morning, the novices whispered that a chill had settled over the sala. One claimed to have seen frost on the Buddha's base. Another said the candles refused to light during morning prayer. Ajahn Combs said nothing, but that night he sealed the doors with string and ash. Old protections, forbidden in most city temples now, but necessary here. Tom stood outside watching him. The abbot's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then quickly away. He knew. That evening, Tom returned to his kuti early. He didn't eat. He didn't chant. He just sat, knees folded, staring at the robe. It lay across his mat now, no longer hidden, as if it had claimed the space. The scent of sandalwood had soured. Beneath it, something metallic now, iron, rust, the edge of blood. He reached for it, but paused, because something else was watching, not from the robe, but from the mirror. A small mirror hung beside his sleeping mat, cracked slightly at the corner, old and plain. He never used it, but now, in its warped reflection, he saw something different. Himself, but older. Not aged, just tired, skin pale, eyes sunken, and something draped around his shoulders. The robe. Not yellow, black, burned at the hem, moving, as if breathing. He blinked, and the mirror shattered. Later that night, the temple cat refused to enter his room. She had always liked him before, curled near his mat, purred during chanting. But tonight she stood at the doorway, hissed once, and fled. Tom did not sleep. The wind outside howled, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like chanting, backwards, spoken in reverse, yet still sacred. And in the lull between gusts, he heard the door to the sala creak open. Even though it had been sealed, even though no key remained. He stood at the window and looked across the courtyard. The door swung wide. The candlelight inside flickered. And something, tall, thin, wrapped in shadow, stepped out. It didn't walk. It glided across the courtyard, toward him. Tom stumbled back from the window, but the figure never came to the kuti. It moved past, toward the Bodhi tree, toward the base of the roots, and there it began to dig, not with hands, with silence. The earth shifted on its own, and something golden emerged, cloth torn, wrapped around bone. A second robe, a second body. And then Tom understood. The robe he had taken was only half the whole. The rest had been buried, severed, hidden beneath the tree to keep the curse from completing. But now it had returned. The next morning, the earth beneath the Bodhi tree looked untouched, but Tom knew better. He could feel the difference. The soil buzzed now, hummed, a low vibration like a mantra spoken without breath. And in the sala, the statue smiled wider. Later that day, a novice fainted during alms. He claimed he saw someone standing behind Tom, a man with no eyes. But everyone else saw nothing. Everyone except Ajahn Kom, who watched Tom now with sorrow, not suspicion, and whispered, "We've seen this before." What do you do when the holy begins to rot? When the thing wearing the robe knows the chants better than you ever could be? When the sala becomes a mouth and the shadows become its teeth? You kneel, you pray, and you pray. The thing listening is still a god. Ajahn Kom stood at the edge of the cremation ground, staring into the cold ashes of the pyre. It was morning, but the sky refused to brighten. The clouds hung low like a lid over a pot, sealing in the scent of smoke and soil. Crows circled above, unsettled. He reached into the ash with a gloved hand and pulled out a shard of bone, burned black, curled like a crescent moon. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "It's starting again," he whispered. Behind him, the elder monk, Ajahn Fry, said nothing. He merely folded his arms tighter into his robe and looked away. Ajahn Fry was old, older than anyone remembered. His face looked carved from river stone, and his silence was heavier than sermons. He spoke only when necessary, and that morning he spoke. "It's the robe," he said. Ajahn Kom didn't respond. Ajahn Fry continued, "He found it, or rather, it found him." Still no answer. Ajahn Fry's gaze darkened. "I told you it should have been burned with the heart." Ajahn Kom turned slowly. There was no heart left, only ash. Ajahn Fry shook his head. "That's not what the fire said." They walked in silence to the ordainment room. It hadn't been opened in days. The novices were forbidden from entering now. A soft string charm, white, frayed, had been tied across the door, sealed with wax. Ajahn Kom took out a key. The door opened with a sigh, like a mouth breathing its first breath in years. The scent inside hit them both, not rot, not mold, but sandalwood burned too long until it became something sour. They stepped in, and it was there. A spot on the floor, bare, empty, where the robe had once lain, where he had once been. Ajahn Fry sat cross-legged in the center of the room. He closed his eyes, began to chant, not loudly, not like a monk, more like a man trying to remember a dream. The words were old, not Pali, older, from the mouth of the forest, from a time before robes were sewn in yellow. Ajahn Kom didn't join in. He lit a candle and placed it in a bowl of water. If it floated, the spirit was at peace. It sank. Ajahn Fry opened his eyes. Still here. They left without sealing the room. They knew it would make no difference now. That evening, Ajahn Kom summoned Tom. The boy arrived with eyes too calm for his age. His footsteps were silent. His robe, freshly laundered, still carried a faint scent of sandalwood, no matter how many times it had been washed. "Sit," the abbot said gently. Tom did. They sat in silence for a while, the candle flickering between them. Finally, Ajahn Kom spoke. "You know, in this region, there used to be monks who weren't monks at all." Tom tilted his head. They shaved their heads, wore the robes, chanted the mantras, but inside they followed something else. He didn't wait for a reply. They practiced sayasat, forbidden sorcery, blended with the Dharma, hidden behind smiles and scriptures. One of them lived here many years ago, before your time, before even mine. Now Tom looked up. They called him Pra Kun, a gifted monk, charismatic, revered, but obsessed with immortality, not of the body, of the spirit. Ajahn Kom's voice grew quieter. He believed the soul could be bound to an object, not just any object, a sacred one, something worn in death, soaked in prayer. Tom said, softly, "A robe." Ajahn Kom nodded. He attempted the ritual during a lunar eclipse, alone. It went wrong. He died mid-chant. Fire consumed his body, but the robe didn't burn. Tom's eyes flickered. Ajahn Kom leaned forward. That robe was sealed, hidden, buried in salt and ash. Half of it cremated, the other half entombed beneath the Bodhi tree. Tom didn't speak. Ajahn Kom whispered, "And now it has been worn again." Tom rose slowly. "I don't understand," but the lie was too smooth. Ajahn Kom did not stop him from leaving, but as the door closed behind him, the abbot whispered a prayer under his breath, one he hadn't spoken in 20 years. A banishment chant, a last resort. That night, the chanting returned, not from the monks, from underneath the temple. The floorboards trembled with voices, low, wet, throaty. They spoke no language, and yet every syllable made sense. Tom sat alone in his kuti, robe beside him, unopened. But the temptation gnawed. It felt it behind his ribs like hunger, not physical, spiritual. He wanted to wear it, not because it gave him power, but because without it he felt empty, like someone had scooped out his soul and left only a smile behind. Outside, the statues turned again. The Naga coiled tighter. The Arahant by the gate tilted its head, and inside the Salah, the Buddha's mouth cracked, open, slightly, just enough for a whisper to slip through. In a forgotten corner of the temple grounds, Ajahn Fry began digging. He moved slowly, hands calloused, breath shallow. He dug until he found the jar, old clay, wrapped in rope. Inside, bone fragments. A tongue, preserved in oil, still curled, still shaped in the final syllable of a chant. He held it up to the moonlight. It pulsed, alive. Siyasat had always required sacrifice, but what no one told the novices was that sometimes the sacrifice was the robe, and sometimes it was the one who wore it.
It was just past midnight when Thom awoke to the sound of his own voice. He wasn't speaking. His lips were closed, but the sound filled the room, deep, rhythmic, echoing, as if it came from beneath the floorboards, or perhaps from inside his chest. Chanting, foreign, familiar, and then silence, so complete it hurt. Thom sat up slowly. His mat was wet with sweat. The robe lay beside him, untouched, but his hands were bleeding, both palms raw and red, as if he'd been kneeling on broken glass or digging bare-handed through stone. The room stank of burnt oil and old copper. Ash clung to the walls, faint but spreading like soot from an unseen fire. And drawn across the floor in a perfect circle of black dust was a yantra, an ancient spell wheel, one he'd never learned. Yet he knew what it meant. It was a gateway, an invitation. Outside, the temple grounds were deathly quiet. No crickets, no frogs, no wind. Only the low hum of something ancient waiting. Thom stepped out into the night, barefoot, robe over his shoulder. The grass was damp, but the air burned against his skin. He wasn't alone. Figures stood in the distance, dozens, not monks, not villagers, not alive. They stood in rows, faceless, swaying, wrapped in old robes, torn and burnt, eyes glowing faintly. He stepped toward them. They did not move. But one stepped forward. Pra Kun. He recognized him instantly, not from photos, not from stories, but from dreams, from the shadows behind the chants. The dead monk's face was pale, lips burned black, but his eyes were alive, terrifyingly so, brimming with knowledge no human should hold. He extended a hand, and Thom took it. In a blink, he was elsewhere, not in the temple, but beneath it, a place that did not exist in maps or memory, a stone hall, circular, windowless, filled with smoke and the sound of distant bells chiming in reverse. Torches lined the walls, but gave off no light, only warmth. In the center of the hall was a raised platform, and on it, a mirror. Not glass, but water, perfectly still, held in a silver basin carved with images of monks eating fire. Pra Kun guided him forward, spoke no words, but Thom heard him anyway. Look. He leaned over the water and saw himself, older, hollow, wearing the robe like skin, chanting with a mouth not entirely his, fingers like bone, eyes like void, and a temple bowing before him. The vision shattered. He awoke back in his kuti, morning light bleeding through the slats. His robe was still folded, but his lips were dry, and the taste of ash lingered on his tongue. The other monks were silent at breakfast. They watched him with polite fear, as if something sacred had begun to rot and they didn't know how to name it. Even the birds avoided the grounds that morning. Even the shadows refused to lean toward him. Ajahn Kom summoned Ajahn Prai before noon. "He's crossed the veil," Kom said. Prai nodded. "I felt it. Last night, the chant opened a gate." Kom whispered, "Do we end it?" Prai looked away. "You know the cost." Kom closed his eyes. "Better one soul lost than many devoured." That night, Thom didn't resist. He wrapped the robe around himself willingly, fully, like armor or surrender. The chanting began at once, not in his mind, but in the air, around him, inside him. It didn't sound like words. It sounded like breathing given shape, the kind of sound you hear in caves older than sunlight, the kind of prayer that doesn't ask, it commands. His eyes rolled back, his spine arched, and his voice joined the others. In the ordainment hall, candles flickered one by one, unlit. Books opened without hands. The statue of the meditating Buddha cracked at the base. From its center, a thin wisp of smoke rose, black, twisting, and then laughter. Not loud, not cruel, but grateful, as if someone had waited a long, long time. By dawn, the ground beneath the Bodhi tree had shifted again, cracked slightly, breathing almost, and beneath it, the second half of the robe was gone. Ajahn Kom stood at the edge of the sala, watching Thom chant alone in the middle of the hall. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was reciting, page after page, mantra after mantra, many of which had been lost to time, and one of which had never been written down. Ajahn Kom wept quietly, because he recognized the final line. It was the same line Pra Kun had spoken the night he died. "Let me burn, so I may never die." The village sat still under the heat of the afternoon sun. Thom walked the dusty road in silence, alms bowl in hand, robe freshly folded. The villagers had begun offering more than rice. They left flowers, folded notes, even relics, rings from dead husbands, cloth from a child's funeral robe, amulets once buried with grandparents. They didn't just want blessings anymore. They wanted intervention. They believed Thom could reach the dead. They weren't wrong. That morning, an old woman approached him after he had received her offering. She knelt at his feet. Her hands trembled, and through tears she whispered, "Luang Pi, can you tell my husband to stop standing in the doorway?" Thom looked at her. I burn incense, I pray, but every night I hear him outside, his sandals, his cough. I lock the door, and still he waits, still he—" She broke down. Thom didn't ask her husband's name. He simply raised his hand and touched her forehead. And then he spoke. Not in Thai, not in Pali, but in Lao, a dialect spoken by only the oldest in the village. Words she hadn't heard in decades. Her husband's words, his phrasing, the little stutter on certain vowels, the nickname only he used for her. Her scream echoed through the rice fields. She told the others. By dusk, they were calling him a seer, a voice of spirits, a bridge between worlds.
They weren't afraid. They were grateful. Only Ajahn Kom was silent. He watched from the sala steps as Tham returned to the temple, bowed before the Buddha statue, and whispered something that made the statue's shadow shift just slightly. That night, the wind blew wrong. It came from the earth, not the sky, upward, not sideways, and in it rode voices, dozens, perhaps hundreds, whispering in every dialect of Isan, in Khmer, in chants long forgotten, a chorus of tongues, each clawing for a mouth. Tham sat in his kuti, eyes closed, robe over his shoulders. He didn't resist, he listened. One voice, soft, broken, called him my son. Another, guttural, malevolent, called him vessel. And still another whispered, we are almost whole. In the sala, the monks gathered for chanting. Tham joined them without a word. As the abbot began the evening sutra, something strange happened. Tham's voice, deep, powerful, began to overlay the others. Not louder, just heavier, more anchored. And as he chanted, the text shifted. He was no longer reading the lines from the sheet. He was speaking different words, ancient, unfamiliar. And yet the monks continued to follow. Their mouths moved in time with his. Even Ajahn Kom felt it, a pull, a rhythm older than memory. And for a moment, just a second, every candle in the hall turned blue. When the chanting ended, no one spoke. Some monks were in tears, others stared blankly ahead. The novice seated beside Tham had wet himself and didn't seem to notice. Ajahn Kom stood up slowly. "What was that?" he asked softly. No one answered, but Tham turned to him and smiled gently. "The first chant," he said, "the one that came before the Dhamma had words." Later that night, Tham walked the temple grounds alone. He approached the well at the edge of the property, long sealed, long forgotten. He removed the stones blocking it, lowered a lantern, and whispered, not a prayer, a command. From deep within the well, something responded, a voice with no shape, no name. It laughed, not cruelly, but familiarly, as if it had known him before he was born. The next day, a child in the village began to speak again after 2 years of silence. He told his mother, "The monk told me my grandpa misses me." She had never told anyone her son had witnessed the old man's death, especially not that his last words were, "Don't let him take me." Ajahn Prai approached Ajahn Kom at sunset. "He speaks in tongues not taught." "I know," Kom replied. "He sees things not shown. He knows. He remembers things never learned." Ajahn Kom turned to him. "But do you know what scares me most?" Ajahn Prai waited. Ajahn Kom whispered, "He's starting to enjoy it." That evening, Tham wrote a chant in his own blood. He didn't know why, only that it came to him in a dream. He drew it on the wall of his kuti, a spiral, a tongue, and eye. And at the center, a robe drawn like a cocoon, bound with soul strings. It pulsed in the moonlight. Possession doesn't always mean screaming and writhing. Sometimes it means you become fluent in the voices of the dead. Sometimes it means you speak truth that should stay buried. And sometimes it means you forget which voice was ever yours. Before the temple bore its current name, before the jungle swallowed the paths, before the paint faded from the walls of the ordainment hall, there was another story. One not told to novices, one remembered only by silence. His name was Fra Kun. He arrived as a bright boy from Sisaket, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, adored by his mother, sent to the forest temple with a blessing and a prayer. He learned quickly, chanted with clarity, memorized the Vinaya before his peers, and by 25, villagers said he glowed when he walked. A boy of gold, they called him, until he stopped calling himself a monk and began calling himself something more. It started with whispers. Fra Kun had a gift, they said. He could see illnesses before they showed symptoms. He knew who would die before the funeral was planned. He called out the names of ancestors in his sleep, and when he laid hands on the sick, their fevers broke. The villagers were grateful. The monks were cautious. Ajahn Boon, the abbot at the time, summoned him. "These gifts you have," the old monk warned, "they come from attention. Beware that you do not feed them." Fra Kun bowed, smiled, and said nothing. But something had already changed. Fra Kun began keeping to himself, studying alone in the library at night, writing in languages no one recognized. He no longer bowed during morning chant. Instead, he stared at the Buddha statue with pity, as if he knew something even the enlightened one had forgotten. One day, he stopped eating, sat beneath the Bodhi tree for 3 days. On the 4th, a storm came. When the monks found him, he was soaked, but dry-eyed. He said he had been spoken to, not by a god, but by his own soul. And it had told him that death was unnecessary, that the spirit could choose to stay, that immortality wasn't a myth, it was a technique. The robe, he claimed, was the answer. Every thread soaked in prayer, every fold steeped in mindfulness, every moment it touched the body, it absorbed the soul print of the wearer. And if bound with the right chant, during the right ritual, under the right moon, it could become a vessel, a house for the spirit, a womb for rebirth. The abbot forbade him from performing the rite. The other monks turned away, but the robe listened, and Fra Kun did it anyway. It was the night of a lunar eclipse. The forest was deathly quiet. Only one novice saw him enter the sala carrying the robe folded like a corpse. He placed it in the center of the hall, drew symbols in chalk and ash around it, lit no candles, used no bell. He sat, he chanted for hours, into the silence, into the blood moon's light, until at last fire erupted from the robe, spontaneous, unnatural, blue at the edges. The monks came running. By the time they burst through the sala doors, the robe was engulfed, and Fra Kun sat inside the flames, unmoving, smiling. They tried to drag him out. The fire wouldn't touch them, but it wouldn't let go of him. It burned, but it didn't consume. His skin blackened, his eyes cracked, but his voice kept chanting until the final word, and then silence. The fire died instantly. No smoke, no ash, just Fra Kun. His body charred, but intact, eyes wide open, as if watching something no one else could see. They prepared a second cremation. His body was laid upon the pyre, oiled, wrapped in a second robe. The villagers wept, the monks chanted, the fire was lit, and once again, it would not burn. The flames danced for hours,
but the body remained. Even when the logs collapsed, even when the heat warped the metal tray, Fra Kun's body sat in the center like a stone, black, rigid, smiling, until Ajahn Boon, in a moment of desperation, poured salt and powdered bone over the corpse. Then, finally, it crumbled, as if it had been waiting for the right offering. But the robe did not burn. It had fallen from his body untouched, not a single thread singed, not a single fold broken, still warm, still fragrant with sandalwood. The monks were terrified. They wanted to bury it, but the abbot insisted it be sealed, cut in half. One piece buried beneath the Bodhi tree, bound in salt and ash, and the other placed in a locked chest behind temple walls, beneath layers of prayer cloth and protection. Let no one wear this again, or it will wear them. But temples forget, monks die, locks rust, and robes wait. Now, decades later, the robe had been found again, not by accident, but by invitation, because it had never stopped whispering, never stopped calling, just waited for the right voice, the right grief, the right soul to wear it like a second skin, and now it had found Phalam. In the silence of the sala, under the same bloodless moon, Phalam stood barefoot in the exact center where Fra Kun once sat, the robe wrapped around him, the chalk lines long gone but remembered, the chants unspoken but ready. And as he breathed in, he heard it, not from the robe, not from the walls, but from inside his own ribs, a voice, his voice, and Fra Kun's, speaking at once. I am the echo of all who refused to die.
The rains came suddenly. No warning, no wind, no thunder. Just a wall of water falling from the sky as if the heavens had burst without ceremony. The monks whispered it was unnatural. The monsoon wasn't due for weeks. The villagers stayed indoors. Even the dogs refused to wander. It rained for 7 days, and Tham didn't leave his kuti once. Inside, the room had transformed. Walls once bare now held diagrams drawn in charcoal, spirals, triangles, chanting wheels, blood-colored sigils scraped with fingernails. The mirror was gone, broken and buried beneath his mat. The floorboards had split from the damp, and beneath the cracks, dark roots pushed upward, not from trees, but from somewhere else. And in the center of the room, the robe lay unfolded, not flat, but standing upright as if worn by an invisible body. It swayed gently, even when there was no breeze, even when the door was sealed. Tham no longer ate. He no longer slept. The chant continued constantly in his throat, a low hum that echoed like bees in a sealed jar. He didn't speak it anymore. It spoke through him. Each day, more voices joined, not outside, inside. Old, male, young, broken, weeping, laughing. A choir of former lives. And every night, the rain grew harder, as if trying to drown the sound. On the third night, a candle lit itself. On the fourth, a wooden Buddha on the shelf turned to face the corner. On the fifth, the rice bowl filled itself with black water. On the sixth, The robe began to bleed, thin streaks of red soaking into the floorboards like ink. And on the seventh, Tham opened his eyes, and they were not his. Ajahn Kom had not left his kuti either. He sat cross-legged, chanting without pause, sweat pouring from his body, candles burning so low they hissed on their own wax. He had seen this before, once, long ago. He had been a young novice then. The night Prakun chanted himself into fire. And now the signs had returned, but worse, because this time it wasn't just one monk, it was the temple itself. Ajahn Prai knocked. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped in, dripping wet, his robe soaked, his hands full of salt and sacred thread. "It's spreading," he said. "I know," Kom whispered. "It's in the walls now." Prai placed a small jar on the table, filled with dirt and hair. They found this buried near the Bodhi tree, still warm. Kom didn't ask whose hair. He already knew. That evening, lightning struck the gate. The Arahant statue split down the middle, and from inside, nothing. Hollow, as if the statue had never been stone, as if it had always been waiting to open. In the village, a child screamed in the middle of the night, said he saw a monk in his room, head shaved, robe torn, eyes glowing. But when the parents lit the lamp, the windows were still sealed, and the floor was covered in muddy footprints. Back in his kuti, Tham began to speak to the shadows, not just as hallucinations, as companions. He gave them names. He laughed when they did. He asked them questions. They always answered, sometimes through the sound of dripping water, sometimes through the creaking wood, sometimes through the mouths of birds that dropped dead at his windowsill. He painted the ceiling red with what no one knew. He covered the door with sacred leaves in reverse, and on the final night of the rain, he sat in the center of the room, the robe draped over his lap, and he whispered, "I'm ready now." Ajahn Kom felt it instantly. His spine snapped upright. The chanting in the sala stopped. Monks looked at one another, unsure why they had gone silent. The air vibrated, not loudly, but deeply, like the hum of a mountain just before it crumbles. The rain slowed, stopped, and in that moment of stillness, a voice echoed across the temple grounds, not shouted, not spoken, but felt, through the wood, through the stone, through the chest of every monk present. The robe is whole. A bell rang, but no one had touched it. The leaves of the Bodhi tree fell all at once, and in the silence that followed, a new sound emerged. Steps, slow, wet, barefoot, coming from Tham's kuti. Ajahn Kom rose. He turned to Prai, his face pale. "Is there still time?" Ajahn Prai didn't answer. He was listening, because he knew that sound. He had heard it before, the night the fire refused to consume, the sound of a soul walking in someone else's skin. And in the distant shadows of the sala, where statues once watched in peace, something stepped down from its pedestal and began to walk.
The bell rang once, low, deep, wrong. It echoed across the temple like thunder whispered into bone. No one had touched the rope. No one dared. Thom stepped out of his kuti barefoot, his robe wrapped tightly around him, not in the usual cross-shouldered fold of a novice, but draped loosely, like a mourner. The fabric trailed behind him, heavy and wet, despite the absence of rain. His eyes were closed, but he did not stumble. He walked with the steadiness of one guided, not by sight, but by memory not his own. In the sala, the monks were already gathered. None had called the assembly, yet they were all there, silent, waiting, not chanting, not praying, just waiting. Their eyes flicked to Thom as he entered, but no one met his gaze. Some did not look at all. One novice shook silently in the back, whispering to himself over and over, "It's not him, it's not him, it's not him." Ajahn Kom and Ajahn Prai stood near the altar. Both had prepared. Salt lines had been drawn around the sala. Ancient protective strings wound around the Buddha's pedestal. Candles flickered in a circle, forming a barrier of flame. And in the center of it all, a bowl of oil, black and rippling, meant to trap the spirit if it tried to flee. But when Thom entered, the flames bent toward him, the salt hissed, and the strings untied themselves. Ajahn Prai whispered, "He's already inside." Ajahn Kom didn't answer. He stepped forward and began the counter-rite. He chanted not in Thai nor in Pali, but in the old tongue, a language older than temples, older than robes, one used only when confronting that which claimed to be divine but was not. Thom did not flinch. He smiled. Ajahn Kom threw the sacred ash. It stopped mid-air, frozen, then turned backwards, blowing into his own face. He coughed violently, fell to one knee. Ajahn Prai stepped in, sprinkling water blessed in 7 provinces. The droplets hissed as they touched Thom's skin, steaming like rain on coals. Still he did not scream. He only opened his eyes, and they were wrong. Not black, not white, but reflective, like the surface of a still pond. Ajahn Prai gasped, "I see someone else!" Thom tilted his head. "You see many." Then, without warning, he began to chant. Not loudly, not fast, but with a rhythm that made the floor creak and the roof shudder. The monks behind him began to sway, not of their own will. Their mouths moved, matching his chant, eyes wide, hands twitching. Their bodies became instruments. Ajahn Kom shouted, "Break the circle!" But the salt had been erased, the candles were snuffed, and the spirit bowl now overflowed not with oil, but blood. Not human, something thicker, something remembered. Thom's voice grew louder. The syllables came faster, too fast, as if the tongue speaking them had practiced across centuries. And then, silence. His body froze. Eyes rolled back, arms limp, mouth open. And from his lips came a second voice. Not layered, not echoed, separate. Male, older, crisp. A voice that had spoken once in fire and returned through ash. "I am Frakun. I am the robe. I am the remembering." Ajahn Kom stepped forward. "You are a shadow," he spat, "a ghost that clings to flesh. This is not your temple." Thom's mouth curled into a grin. "This was never yours." He stepped forward. The floor cracked beneath his bare feet.
Every step made the monks flinch, yet none moved. It was as if the air itself held them down. "I have chanted more years than you have drawn breath," the voice said. "I have sat in stillness while your ancestors burned incense to statues they did not understand." A Joncom raised a knife, ceremonial, blessed, sharpened with salt and silence. He held it high. "If you stay," he warned, "we will send you back piece by piece." Thom raised his hand, not to strike, but to invite. "Then begin." A Joncom lunged, but Thom's other hand was already moving, not physically, but ritually, drawing circles in air, chanting in reverse, and before the knife reached his body, it turned to dust, gone, like it had never been forged. A Joncom fell to his knees, defeated, weeping, not for himself, but for the boy. And then something broke. A cry echoed through the sala, not Thom's, not Frakun's, but something deeper. A cry of too many voices in one throat, a sound of a soul splitting from inside. And Thom collapsed. For a moment there was only breath, ragged, human, his. A Jun Prai rushed to him, lifting the boy's head. Thom's eyes fluttered. He whispered, "I didn't ask for this." Then his body convulsed, arched, and the voice that followed was not his. "But you wore me anyway." The candles exploded. The room plunged into darkness, and from it a shape rose. Not flesh, not smoke, but memory, weaponized. The robe lifted from Thom's shoulders, floated, spun, and began to wrap itself around him again, tighter, 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 as if it would pull him inside itself. A Joncom screamed, "Burn it, now!" But the fire refused to light. The matches snapped. The oil refused to catch, because fire had already failed this robe once, and it would not be tricked again. Possession is not a door that opens. It is a home that grows inside you. And tonight, the foundations were complete. Tam lay motionless on the temple floor. The sala was dark. Every candle had died. Every window had cracked. The air was thick with smoke that didn't rise. It settled like it had weight, like it wanted to stay. The other monks had fled. A Joncom and a Jun Prai remained, seated cross-legged on either side of the boy, eyes closed, hands folded, whispering the oldest chants they knew, not to exercise, but to keep the soul from breaking. Because Tam was still in there, somewhere, fighting. Inside Tam's mind, there was no sound, no voice, no chant, only stillness. He floated through blackness. Time didn't pass. Light didn't exist. He drifted until a shape appeared ahead, a mirror suspended in the dark. He approached. What stared back wasn't him. It was Pra Kun, but different now. Not the burning monk, not the chanting ghost. This version was younger, smiling, sad, and so familiar. Tam spoke first. "What are you?" Pra Kun didn't answer. He only asked, "Why did you wear the robe?" Tam opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't know. Because he did. Because grief is louder than reason. Because power fills the space where love used to be. Because silence wears many faces. He finally whispered, "I missed my father." Pra Kun's reflection nodded, and for a moment there was no anger, only recognition. Then the mirror shattered and everything changed. Tom found himself standing in a circle of fire, but it didn't burn. Each flame showed a different image. In one, he was a child, watching his father's body wrapped in white cloth, lowered into the cremation pyre. In another, he was older, sitting under the Bodhi tree, whispering prayers with no answers. In a third, he was wearing the robe, smiling as the villagers knelt before him. But the fourth flame showed nothing, just darkness and laughter. From behind, the voice came again. Pra-kun. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Tom turned. You possessed me. I only filled the space you opened. You tried to take my body. I tried to give you purpose. Tom clenched his fists. You're lying. Pra-kun stepped closer. Am I? Then why do you still wear the robe? Tom looked down. It was on him. Again. Hadn't noticed, hadn't chosen. It had simply appeared, as if it belonged to him now, as if it had always been there. Suddenly he heard a third voice, soft, breaking. His father's voice. Tom, you must let go. Tom spun around. There he was, not glowing, not ghostly, just present. As he remembered, rough hands, gentle eyes, the man who used to carry him on rainy days. Papa! His father stepped forward. I never asked you to carry me. That grief was never meant to be a burden. Tears blurred Tom's vision. I didn't want to forget you. And you never will. But this robe isn't remembrance. He reached out, placed a hand over his heart. It's a chain. Pra-kun watched, eyes dimming, as if the weight of what he had done, what he had become, was finally visible to him. He spoke quietly. I wore the robe because I feared death. Tom looked at him. I wore it because I feared life without meaning. The fire faded, the mirror reformed, the silence returned. Ajahn Prai opened his eyes. In the real world, Tom had begun to stir. Ajahn Kom watched closely, gripping his mala beads, lips pale. The boy's breathing slowed. The robe unraveled, thread by thread, folding itself beside him, like a pet laying down. Then Tom sat up, eyes open, clear. His, but not alone. He looked at the two old monks and spoke softly. He's not gone. Ajahn Kom frowned. Then where is he? Tom placed a hand over his chest. He's asleep, inside me, waiting. Prai asked, can he take control again? Tom shook his head. No, because he's broken. Ajahn Kom nodded slowly. You survived. No, Tom said. I shared. That night the sala was cleaned. The blood was gone. The candles were relit. The robe was locked away, not buried, not burned, folded, sealed, placed in a shrine beneath the floor, surrounded by salt, prayer beads, and 7 sacred leaves, and above it a sign carved in teak. Let the robe rest, or it will rise. Tam returned to the village weeks later. He spoke little, chanted often, smiled softly. The villagers still brought him offerings, but now he refused anything personal. No names, no stories, only prayers and silence. Inside, he knew the spirit still stirred, but it no longer controlled. They lived in quiet tension, like roommates sharing a mind, each aware, each waiting, but for now, at peace. because sometimes the soul doesn't win by purging the darkness. Sometimes it wins by learning not to surrender, even when the whispers never stop.
The temple returned to quiet. Not peace, not purity, just quiet. The kind that feels like breath held too long, the kind that waits. Tom no longer heard voices in the dark, but he felt pressure. Every sunrise brought a weight in his chest, a heaviness that pulsed with the heartbeat of something not quite him. He still wore the novice's robe by day, but the cursed robe, the other one, he knew where it waited. Folded beneath the sala floor, breathing without lungs, listening through wood. Ajahn Kom could see it in Tom's eyes, the fatigue, the shadows, the way he paused before answering, the moments where his face twitched just slightly, as if resisting a second voice about to surface. The abbot waited 3 days before speaking. They sat under the Bodhi tree. The leaves had returned after the rain, but none of them rustled in the wind. They simply hung there, still, listening. Kom looked at the boy. "You are still bound." Tom nodded. "He's not fighting anymore. But he's not gone. And he won't be. No." Ajahn Kom folded his hands. His voice was gentler than it had ever been. "Then we must end it." The rite had not been performed in 60 years. It was older than the monastery, a ritual not of banishment, but of release, not to force the spirit out, but to give it no place left to hide. And it required only one thing. The vessel must offer itself to fire. Not metaphor, not prayer. Real flame, real flesh, real risk. Tom didn't hesitate. He agreed before the sentence was finished. Ajahn Prai wept, but said nothing, because he knew the robe would never rest if it was merely locked away. It had to return to ash, and so did the spirit inside it. The ritual was prepared in silence. The sala was cleared. Salt poured in 7 concentric rings. Sandalwood oil soaked the floor. A single flame waited in a bowl at the center. The robe was retrieved. It trembled in the hands of the novice who carried it, even though no wind blew. It was placed on a low wooden dais, and beside it, Tom sat cross-legged, waiting, willing. The monks gathered around the sala, but none stepped inside. Even Ajahn Kom remained at the door. Only Ajahn Prai joined the circle, seated opposite Tom. They exchanged no words, just a bow, a knowing. Then the chant began. It was called the Song of Severing, a chant so old its syllables no longer existed in language, only in memory, passed monk to monk like a burden. Tom began it alone. Each word made his tongue ache. Each breath felt like it dragged heat from his lungs. The robe twitched, then rose. It lifted from the dais and hovered. Its sleeves stretched outward. Its folds rippled not like cloth, but like wings. Shadow poured from its center, slow at first, then faster. The robe spun mid-air, unraveling thread by thread. Screams filled the room, not from Tom, not from Prai, but from every soul bound inside the fabric. A howl of undoing, a mourning of forced departure. But Tom didn't stop. He kept chanting, louder, stronger. And as he did, the robe tried to flee. It twisted toward the open door, but the salt glowed, and the oil ignited. Flame crawled from the center outward, encircling Tom, encircling the robe, encircling the past. Ajahn Kom stepped forward, heart pounding. He saw the fire lick Tom's robes. He screamed, "Enough!" But Tom kept chanting. The fire climbed higher, wrapped around him, not consuming, choosing. The chant reached its final line, and in that moment, Tom raised his eyes. He looked through the fire, through the robe, through the veil, and whispered one final phrase: "Let go." The robe collapsed, black ash filled the air, and the flame died instantly. No smoke, no heat, just silence. Then, a breeze. The first real breeze in weeks, and the monks outside felt the weight lift, like something buried under their skin had been dug up and carried away. Tom lay in the center of the sala, untouched, breathing, alive, but changed. Ajahn Prai lifted him gently. Kom helped him to his feet. Tom opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked. All he said was, "He's gone." Then he wept, not from pain, not from fear, but from the kind of grief that only comes after the soul is clean. That night, the moon was full, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like an omen. It felt like closure. And in the ashes of the sala, the monks found a single thread, gold, unburned. They placed it inside a small jar, sealed it with wax, buried it beneath the Bodhi tree. And this time, nothing moved. Some fires destroy, some purify, but the rarest make space for something new to grow.
The tree had stood for over 100 years. Its roots ran deep through the earth and into old bones. It had shaded novices as they meditated. It had listened to chants, absorbed incense smoke, watched grief and joy pass in equal measure. But it had also kept secrets. Beneath the Bodhi tree, something had always waited, wrapped in cloth, bound in ash, feeding on memory, and tonight it would see fire. The temple was quiet, no drums, no bells, only wind. The ritual had been performed, the robe destroyed, but Ajahn Kon knew what remained, the other half, the root core of the curse, what was buried long ago when Pra Kun failed, not fully burned, not fully released. A hidden fragment, a promise that if ever called again, it would rise. And now it had tasted attention once more. It had listened from beneath the soil as Tom chanted. It had remembered itself. So they would burn it, not with oil, not with firewood, with chant, with presence, with the final ingredient Pra Kun never possessed, acceptance. Tom stood barefoot beneath the tree. His body still ached, not from wounds, from emptiness, like something had been removed from him too quickly, leaving the edges raw. But his mind was clear, his voice steady, and in his heart there was no hatred, not even toward Pra Kun. Ajahn Prai walked the circle, sprinkling salt. Ajahn Kon lit the 9 candles, one for each life the robe had taken over the years, directly or through misfortune. The monks gathered at a distance. They did not chant, they only watched. This was not a rite for witnesses. This was a farewell. Tom knelt before the exposed roots. Ajahn Kon handed him the small clay jar. Inside, the last thread of the robe, golden, unburnt, still warm. He placed it in a hollow between the roots, and with a match lit from the Sala's eternal flame, he touched it to the thread. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a flicker, a low flame, blue, then black, then white, a fire not of heat, but of memory. Smoke rose but did not smell of burning. It smelled of wet stone, old wood, and tears. And as it climbed into the air, Tom began the final chant, not of severing, not of power, but of release. A chant spoken only once in a monk's lifetime. A chant that says, "You may go now." The roots trembled, the ground cracked. From beneath the tree a burst of wind erupted upward, lifting dust and leaves in a spiral. And for a heartbeat, everyone heard it. A voice, not Pra-Kun's, a child's voice, a woman's, an elder's, then dozens, then hundreds, a cascade of thank yous, goodbyes, forgives, and frees, a choir of spirits unhooked. The flame pulsed once more, then vanished. No smoke, no ash, no heat, only silence, only air, only peace. A John Pry fell to his knees. A John Cone bowed deeply. Tom remained kneeling, eyes closed, breath steady. The Bodhi tree above him whispered once, leaves rustling softly, then grew still. And in that stillness, Tom felt something for the first time in months, lightness. Later, when he opened his eyes, the jar was gone. Not broken, not buried, just gone. As if the earth had swallowed it, or the sky had reclaimed it. The monks dispersed quietly. No celebration, no explanation. Only the deep understanding that something had ended, and because of that, something could begin. That night, Tom returned to his kuti. For the first time, he lit no candle. He slept deeply, without dreams, without voices, without whispers in the dark. And beneath the Bodhi tree, where once fire had kissed old roots, a single flower bloomed, white, small, unremarkable, but impossible. Because the Bodhi does not flower in this region, and yet here it was, alive, present, whole. Sometimes the only way to end a haunting is to let the ground grieve.
The sun rose gently that morning. No red sky, no storm warnings, just a soft orange hue spilling across the forest canopy, as if the heavens themselves had exhaled. The rain had not returned. The wind no longer carried whispers. The temple was quiet, truly quiet. Not the silence of fear or tension, but the kind found at the end of a long prayer. Tham stepped out of his kuti with his alms bowl in hand. His robe was clean, his head freshly shaved. The scent of sandalwood no longer followed him, only earth, smoke, grass, human smells, honest smells. As he walked through the village, the people greeted him with bowed heads and open palms. No one asked for spirit messages. No one mentioned miracles. A few pressed rice into his bowl. One old woman handed him a banana leaf-wrapped parcel. A child offered a single flower. He smiled at them all. The chants that had once haunted him were now echoes far behind, and the robe,
The other robe was no more. He could still remember the weight of it, but memory no longer meant bondage. It was now just that, memory. Back at the temple, Ajahn Kom stood at the edge of the sala, watching the novices sweep the courtyard. Ajahn Pai sat beneath the Bodhi tree, humming an old melody no one remembered teaching him. Birds had returned to the branches. The cat, once too afraid to enter Tham's kuti, now slept curled by his doorway. Even the Naga statue by the gate had been scrubbed clean. Its eyes no longer seemed to follow anyone. Later that day, as Tham sat alone near the water basin cleaning his alms bowl, he paused. There was something inside, not food, not a leaf, a single pinch of ash, gray, dry, cold. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He simply looked at it for a long time, then lifted it gently in his fingers and whispered, "Thank you." Then he let it scatter in the breeze, because some things don't leave with fire. They leave when they're forgiven. That night, as the monks chanted their final verses of the day, Tham sat quietly in the back. He no longer led. He no longer needed to. And when the final bell sounded, he walked alone toward the edge of the forest, where the moonlight slipped through the leaves like silver threads, where the air smelled like soil, where the dead no longer waited, just listened from a distance, at peace. And in the silence that followed, deep within the shadows, something smiled, not with malice, not with hunger, but with relief. A soul that had finally been seen, and a boy who had never truly been lost, only chosen.